Dear church, let's talk sermon construction with Bishop Darby. Welcome to the Dear Church podcast. I'm your host, Chris McCurley. We are wrapping up our series on sermon construction. Over the last few weeks, we've had a variety of guests, ministers on here talking about the way that they tackle a sermon, what goes into putting it together, building it, and then preaching it on Sunday. And I'm excited to wrap up this series with my friend Bishop Darby. Bishop, typically in Ohio, but this week in Corinth, Mississippi, and we can get into all of that here in a second. But Bishop, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, it's a blessing to be here, Chris. I was honored that you asked, and I have loved the podcast so far and excited to be a part of it.
Yeah, so tell us a little bit for those who may not be familiar with Bishop Darby. By the way, Bishop's his first name, not a title. But Bishop, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, actually, it's funny you say that. My first ever preaching job was a tiny church in Northeast Ohio. I walk in the first day. I introduce myself. Hi, I'm Bishop Darby, the speaker here. And the lady looks at me and goes, "Honey, that church is down the road." So that's kind of been a running thing. No, I am a minister at the Marysville Church of Christ in Marysville, Ohio. Been there for about 5 years now. Hard to believe how time flows. My wife, Madison, and I just welcomed our first baby girl a year ago. Her name is Noe. She is life-changing in the best way. But we are enjoying our ministry there. We are enjoying the people we're doing it with. And life is spectacular right now. Yeah.
And this is a unique ministry position in that you work with your father in the place where you grew up, right?
Near where I grew up. I grew up going to Fisher and Kinney Road, Church of Christ. But they took that job, my dad did, when I left for college. And so I came home to a unique environment, and every time I'd come visit, I got to know the church there. And when I had a job opening, they invited me to come, and been there ever since.
Yeah. And so the connection here with you and I is we are, I don't know if you can say related, but my daughter, who is the church secretary there at Foot Street, where you're recording from, my daughter Keely is married to Ian Job, whose sister is your wife. So
that's correct. Yeah.
I don't know how we do all that, but somehow, some way there is a connection. You went to Free Artemis. That's where you met Madison, and got out doing ministry in Ohio, and you came down for a wedding to Corinth, and your car broke down, and so you couldn't get back just yet, and so now you're recording from the church building there at Foot Street. So making it work.
We're making it work. We got a couple of paper boxes here, some makeshift studio work, but no, the church is here is really nice for letting us do that. And yeah, Chris, I'll definitely claim you as family if you'll claim me. I think you have the harder end of the bargain there.
Not at all. No, I appreciate that very much. And I always enjoy when we are able to get together, which is not very often, but when we do, when we can talk and just kind of have a conversation about ministry, because I think you bring a unique perspective. And, one of our good friends is Ralph Gilmore, and Ralph always appreciated your perspective. Ralph always has perspective, right? And I always appreciated your perspective. And then as I've gotten to know you, I do as well. And so I wanted to have you on to talk about just, what is your approach when it comes to specifically building a sermon? Like, where do you draw ideas from, and how do you take that idea and flesh it out?
Chris, when I was in college, I read a book. It was called Being Present in the Presence of God by Brother Lawrence. And there's been many iterations of it, but the premise is very simple. The premise is live your life in such a way that you are constantly discerning God's will in moments and his voice in moments. So a couple years ago, I started a habit of carrying around a small notebook in my pocket. Mm-hmm. And whether I'm by a river, in the woods, having a conversation with a parishioner, or just a Bible study with somebody, a lot of times ideas will come to me on topics that are of relevance, and I'll write them down in that notebook. In between series, or when we're setting series for a year, I'll open up that notebook, and the first thing Dad and I'll do is pray over that list, and kind of ask for God to kind of show us what in this list that he wants to see. It's funny how God always seems to work in unique ways, speaking to Moses
Yeah.
from a bush and Elijah from a mountain, and some of the best sermons I've ever had have been in gas stations. So we just try to stay present in those moments to listen to what he wants, and then keep track of them. But that's generally where we start, is coming together, him and I, and putting together kind of our lists and where we want to see things go.
Yeah, what a novel idea to include God in all
Yeah.
this process. I think it's easy for me sometimes to. In fact, I was praying about this morning. I was telling God it's so easy for me to get lost in the process of ministry and forget why I do it and who I do it for. Because I've always felt like the relationship comes first, right? And so you get the relationship right and let that trickle down. And I can preach that and maybe even sound pretty convincing doing it. But then when it comes to putting it in action, I'm constantly having to remind myself, hey, remember why you're doing this. Remember why you're doing this. So I appreciate that you said that. So where you, once you get this idea of what you're going to preach, talk a little bit about how you put it down on paper and kind of get your thoughts sorted out.
Yeah. So once we do it yearly, an idea that I actually stole from you. But we put together a yearly calendar for what we're going to preach through. And we organize it based on our church needs, based on what we think God's calling us for. But on a weekly basis, it's the Monday I come into the office, I'm preaching on Sunday. The process is actually pretty structured. I always like to spend the first day doing nothing but spending the morning praying and just reading over the text over and over again, multiple times. And as weird as this may sound, in different locations, I will start with a cup of coffee at my kitchen table, and I'll read through the text before I get into the office. Get into the office, and I'll do it in my office, and then I'll do it in the elder's office. As weird as it sounds, it's a big cognitive thought game where in different locations, your brain associates different thoughts. And so by going to different places and experiencing the word in different ways, it allows you to think circumspectly around the text. So I will do that on Monday, and then I'll put together a skeleton outline on Tuesday. I'll meet with the staff, and we'll run through the sermon topic of what we're going to cover, whether Dad's preaching, I'm preaching, whatever. And we'll run through the thoughts of the staff. Hey, what about this idea? What do you think about this? On Wednesday is my final write day. I'll write the full sermon, put together the slides. Thursday is a run-through day. I run it a couple times by myself in the auditorium. People walking in must think I'm crazy, but I like to do that. And then Friday is kind of my final touch day. But, Chris, you've been doing ministry longer than I have. A sermon's never done. Just Sunday comes. And I think given time, I would never actually preach a sermon. I would just keep retooling it over and over forever.
Yeah. I can totally relate to that. So I know you're sharing the pulpit with your dad. What is your responsibilities from the pulpit? Are you preaching every other Sunday? Is it Sunday morning, Sunday night? How does that work?
It generally it's just going to be on topic. That's kind of how we differentiate it. Both him and I have different strengths. I usually serve as like worship coordinator and I like the lead singer or whatever, and we'll rotate those jobs. But generally, we have a motto at our church that says, "Do what only you can do." And so we try to empower our staff, our ministers, to do what only they can do. There are many topics that'll come to the table, and I'll look at Dad and say, you're a master's in counseling. This is a very personal a sermon for you, and I feel like this is something you could do. There's many times where he comes to the table and says, this involves Greek study and stuff that I'm not familiar with. I think this one's for you. And so we just try to constantly approach it by a strength-based method.
So it's got to be really convenient and helpful to have your dad right there with you. How often do you use him as a resource, and what other resources are you going to kind of help put together the lesson?
Yeah, like I said, we meet every week to discuss the sermon because his perspectives are invaluable. Not only does he have the practical wisdom of years of doing it, but like I mentioned, he's a master's in counseling, and he actually has his undergraduate degree in biology. And so he brings a lot of interesting, different perspectives. So yeah, we definitely bounce ideas off each other. I'm actually right now in school finishing up my master's, getting ready for PhD in the fall and all that. And so a lot of the resources I use are in the field that I like to study. I love the early church. And so a lot of my first resources is to explore first century thinkers and writers, their insights are usually so much more dynamic than ours. And it allows me to kind of see it from the people who were there, reading the words of John as he's reflecting on Christ, or John's followers as he's reflecting on what John used to say. I usually start there. That's like my number one resource to develop from.
Yeah, I like that. I want to go back to something you said just a moment ago. You talked about how you read the text, changing locations, and I've done that in prayer. I haven't really done it in the textual study. That's very interesting to me because I will walk around the church building on like Thursdays in the morning and pray for our church and pray for our shepherds, pray for our deacons and staff. And, I just, it's something that I've developed the habit of doing. I've never read the text in different locations. Talk a little bit more about that, because you mentioned something, the cognitive reading part, or the cognitive aspect of it that helps you. Talk a little bit about the benefits of changing locations when you read.
Yeah, it's I wish I could take credit for it. It's actually an ancient Jewish practice that rabbis would do when they would teach. And their rationale, though they didn't have the science to back it up that we do today, is very simple. It's that, under a tree, the smells of the tree, the being in nature with God. When I'm reading a psalm and I'm under a tree with the wind in my face and the sun on my feet, then I'm going to be thinking about God in a unique way. Versus if I'm indoors or hearing, one of my favorite things is reading the text while I'm listening to my daughter babble in the other room. The other day I had a moment like this. I was preparing for a sermon over the Isaiah Psalm, beautiful passages in Isaiah 44 and 45. And that passage where God says, for I have called you, you are mine. And as I'm reading those words, I'm hearing my daughter in the other room, pitter-pattering around. And in that moment, that text took on a different form than it would have if I was in isolation in my office. God says that the text is alive in our life, and it is a living word that does so much for us. And giving it legs, putting it in different places and allowing it to impact us in different ways has been meaningful. From the cognitive perspective, it's just science. Different smells, locations, lights, places will engage different avenues in your brain. And so being able to take in different places, open up your brain to full awareness, to different things that the text could be saying. So as nerdy as it sounds, it's been massive for me in ministry. And I would definitely encourage people, if you're listening to this right now, try it, give it a shot and see the way that things may change.
Yeah, I love, this is why I wanted different perspectives during this whole process, is because I love to hear how other guys attack sermon prep, because what we have learned through this whole series is there's more than one way to do this, and no one way is the best way. It's what works for you, right? Because, like, for instance, I plan a year in advance my sermons, and I've got dear preacher friends who are really, really good at preaching who say, yeah, I can't do that. I work better under pressure. I work better starting off Monday and finishing on Friday. To me, that scares me to death, to come into the office on Monday and have to figure out what I'm going to preach on Sunday. I like to know that ahead of time. It sounds like you do too. So talk a little bit about what goes into your laying out a sermon schedule. What are you drawing from? What are you thinking about? I mean, obviously you've got your, a hand on the pulse of the congregation, but what are you going with as a determining factor when it comes to, or factors when it comes to putting together a sermon schedule?
Yeah. So one of the unique opportunities that I have at Marysville is that we have a variety of staff members, and I'm the only one who has ever actually gone to school to be a trained minister. Like I mentioned before, my father is a biology major. He taught high school biology. One of our other staff members worked in hospital administration before becoming a minister. And so it's, when we sit down together, a lot of it is perspective. We have the lesson planner and my father who looks to create curriculum on a large scale because that's what he was trained to do. And then like that, we have me who serves more as I think this is what our church needs to hear in this moment. And then we have our third staff member who comes in with a very mechanical mind towards management, being able to say actually, if we organize it this way and then this way, it may flow. So a lot of it is going to be that. Ultimately, our policy is twofold. It's going to be relatable and it's going to be flexible. Relatability, as you mentioned, having the hand on the pulse of the congregation is what's key. We do what we do because of our love for Christ and our love for his church. And so we want to be the servant that they need in that moment. But the other part of it is, and I think this is a very underappreciated thing, is the flexibility. I'm a rigid person. I like to create my schedule and I like to stay to it.
Yes.
But as I think all of us who have ever preached can relate, there's this moment. You're behind the pulpit, you're giving a point, and there's this annoying thought that just keeps bouncing in your head. And finally, you give in and you say it. And then afterwards, someone comes up to you and says, that's what I needed more than anything else in your sermon. And you realize that God, what he wants so much out of his ministers is someone who's willing to put in the work and effort, but in the moment, be attuned enough to him to be able to be his voice to the church when they need it. So our approach for year-round ministry is always just preparation, obviously, relatability, and then flexibility, being able to address needs as they arise. Man, some of the best moments, some of the best sermon series have been as a result of us and our stubbornness being overrun by God trying desperately to reach his people.
No, I love that. I mean, I love the relatability, obviously, and the flexibility, because there have been many times where I have, the best laid plans, and something happens within our congregation or maybe in the culture around us. I'm personally not one that buys into, the old saying, have a Bible in one hand and a newspaper in the other. I don't necessarily think that I'm a current events preacher. It's fine if somebody else does. But however, sometimes things are laid at your doorstep and you have to approach them. And so you've got to be willing to pivot. And I like that you said that, adapting and adjusting. I'm like you. When I've got my routine set or my schedule set, I don't like to deviate from it, but sometimes you have to, right? So
yeah. We serve a God who is very much about sometimes thwarting our best laid plans for his glory.
Don't you know it? Yeah. So Bishop, you said something a while ago that I wanted to dive into a little bit more, and that is, once you've got your sermon down on paper, and now you're going to take it and preach it to the congregation, preparing to do that. You like to kind of old school, get in front of an empty auditorium behind the pulpit and go through it. I used to do that, and even every so often when I've got a very heavy subject, I'll do that just to make sure that I've got it down the way I want to. What other things do you do in order to make sure that you've got this down? How many times you run through it? I mean, talk a little bit about that routine.
Yeah, so my first run through, I usually do on Wednesday night or Thursday morning, and it's usually terrible. And then I kind of go back through and I adjust, identify, hey, when I was talking, I realized I wasn't covering this enough. I need to cover this more. So a lot of it's going to be that. I'll run through it probably once or twice before we are live on Sunday. But another huge part of my preparation, and I don't want to sound too strange by saying this, but my big belief is that I am not as smart as the collective. And so one of my biggest things is inviting people who I trust into the sermons. Inviting, obviously I mentioned the staff, but one of my biggest things is if I'm going to be preaching out of the Old Testament, and I have a friend who, I'm going to school with who is specializing in the Old Testament, I want their eyes on it. And I definitely credit them in the sermon. I try to spend some time shouting out those who helped. But at the end of the day, I have my limitations, and I am not the best speaker. I am not the smartest guy. I am not the most compassionate. I am not the best when it comes to relationship. And so in order to overcome my deficiencies, of which there is a list of them, I want to make sure that I surround myself during the preparation process with the people who can help. A couple weeks ago, I was doing a sermon on Jewish law, the idea of covenant in the Jewish eyes. And as weird as it sounds, I sent it to a lawyer. And I said, hey, from your legal perspective, what are your thoughts? Some incredible insights came from that. So a lot of my preparation actually just involves bringing in a variety of experts and people who can speak, even if they're not in the religious field, who can speak to their field into my text. And so that way, when I get up in front on Sunday, I can try to present a lesson that is plays to my strengths, but also overcomes my weaknesses by the collective wisdom.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. I know that in the podcast, when we've approached certain subjects like abortion, we have tried to invite guests on who have lived it, right? I can remember many times over a news station approaching a topic about religion. Maybe they're talking about the Church of Christ, and they'll have a Baptist minister come on to talk about the Church of Christ. And you're like, well, how about just having a Church of Christ minister come on, right? So when you're looking at certain topics, trying to get the perspective of people who have lived it or who are currently living it, I think is so key. And I think that brings a perspective that maybe we might overlook as the preacher. Let me tell you about this, even though I don't know anything about it because I've never lived it, right? I mean, some subjects we can get away with that, but it would behoove us to include some people who have actually gone through that. So I love that idea. I think that would strengthen your argument, wouldn't it? For sure.
Yeah. And at the end of the day, that sermon I mentioned earlier about the Isaiah Psalm, there's a lot of divorce language that God uses. As someone who's never experienced the pain of that, I reached out to a friend of mine who's a minister who has. And the way he could speak life into a text and bring it to understanding in a way that I literally never could. By the end of our conversation, I was brought to tears by his testimony and his story. And being able to take some of his insights to the congregation, a lot of people came up and said that was some of their favorite parts. And immediately I had to be like, this is why we do it in community. This is why we're part of a bigger kingdom, because Bishop Darby doesn't need to be everything that Bishop Darby plus others can be.
Yeah. While we can be a spokesman on any biblical topic, certainly the supporting arguments from people who have been there and lived it are extremely helpful. Let's shift gears for just a second. Let's talk about notes. So we've talked about already on this podcast how, notes are not the devil. I think some people sometimes feel like, I don't need to use any notes. I need to have it down enough that I can just recite it from memory, which is great. I mean, I always admire people who can do that. However, I also don't think that notes are a bad thing. I don't think that we should be reading a book report necessarily, but I think there's a middle ground here. What about you? Are you a manuscript guy? Are you an outline? I think you said something about an outline a while ago. And how much do you use notes, or how little do you use notes in your preparation, in your sermon?
So that is such a contested thing. Even between my dad and I, we fight all the time. He has to manuscript his out. I can't. Yeah. I can't do it. I tried, but then if I get off, I'm over. So I'm an outline kind of guy. And during the sermon, I actually have two sets of notes. I have the set of notes that I have in preparation that I use when I'm doing my run-throughs, and I'll bring those up on the podium and I'll keep them on the left side. But on the right side, I keep a series of kind of like bullet points that kind of keep the flow going. And my rationale is, by the time I get up there on Sunday, I have a lot of it memorized. However, as we mentioned just a moment ago, God sometimes has a funny way of interjecting his thoughts, and being able to be open to that while also staying on topic and on flow is vital. And so I keep my notes in case something happens and I get off. I keep the bullet points to ensure that as I'm going through, I can hit key lines. I provide guided notes a lot of times for the congregation, or I will supplement it with an article I'll send out the next day. And so whatever I am trying to do by keeping those key points is kind of like antennas to bring the audience back in over and over again to this idea that I want to keep settling in and bringing home. So that's generally my model. I'll have an outline on one hand, and I'll have kind of the key objectives always in front of me to never lose sight of.
Yeah. So you said something about sending out an article the next day. Talk a little bit about that.
Okay, so I wish I could say that this is this was well thought through, but the reality is, as you know and others know, the greatest parts of the sermon sometimes are the parts that are left on the cutting board. And so there are so much there sometimes that we can't cover in a 25 to 30 minute sermon on a Sunday. So being able to circle back through and kind of take the relevant pieces of information and tie it in as a continual Bible study throughout the week has been something that we found is beneficial. Sitting it out and saying, we covered X, Y, and Z, but have you ever considered how this affects A, B, and C? And during your weekly Bible study and prayer time, consider that. So it allows second level buy-in, not only the practical elements of the sermon itself, but then practical research legs, study legs of meditation for the full week for our parishioners. It's been something that we found some success at. We don't do it every week. Some weeks the sermon itself is heavy enough that we want people to really dissect that. But every once in a while, that's a good tool we have to kind of engage members, not just on Sundays, but Mondays, Tuesdays, Wednesdays as well, getting them into the Word of God.
Yeah. I love that idea. We do connect groups or small groups on Sunday nights, and they're small. They're about 10 or 12 in each group. We have about 25 groups, and one of the things that we do is we have discussion time about the sermon. So we take about 3 discussion questions from the sermon on Sunday morning, and we go around the room. And we don't want it to be a class time setting. We don't want it to be somebody preaching a lesson. We want to discuss. So how do we make this stick? So kind of a similar thing, but I love that idea because I've always felt like, we can listen to a sermon, but how do we make it stick with a person so that they can apply it through the rest of the week? So anything like that, I think, is really helpful. Bishop, you're still relatively new at this whole preaching gig. Talk about what are some of the biggest things that you have learned so far? What has stuck out to you as maybe something you didn't expect, or maybe the biggest challenge or the biggest blessing? Any of that? What has stuck out to you in your first few years in ministry?
Yeah, so I think the number one thing that I've learned through this process is that God is ultimately the one who is trying to get the job done. I just happen to be the tool that he's using. So many times in ministry, it's easy for us to get caught up in ego. It's easy for us to get caught up in our pride. It's easy for us to get caught up in our reputation. How did the church like that sermon? Did I stutter around that too much? Did I do this? Did I do that? And though it's important to care a lot about making sure that the message is clear, I think so many times, at least for me, and this is vulnerability, I'm a very proud person, and I struggle a lot with keeping my pride in check. And I think the thing that ministry's taught me is humility, that this isn't my church. This isn't my body. This isn't my members. I am simply a person God is putting there, a part of the family to help guide them towards him. So I think the humility part's huge. And I'm learning the older I get, the more I know, the more I study, the less I know, and the more I need to rely on him. I wish I was as good of a minister as I thought I was my sophomore year of Freed-Hardeman University. I thought I knew as much as I did at 19, at 29. And I am constantly being reminded by God that his church is beautiful, and I need to find my place in it and make sure that it is always, like he says in Philippians 2, for the benefit of others and not selfish ambition or gain. So that's been probably my biggest lesson, and one that God has really had to drive home in me and in my heart over and over again. And it has given me a profound love for his people. It has given me a profound sense of honor in the profession that I have. But I think most of all, what it's done is given me a deep respect for the challenge that God has constantly in leading knuckleheads like me and using spokespeople like me for his glory. So yeah, that's been probably my biggest lesson thing I've had to wrestle with in ministry, is constantly reminding myself afterwards. It doesn't matter if people say, great sermon, I really liked it, or are critical, to not let either side get to my head, but to keep my eyes on the vision and my ears open to what God's leading me towards.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. It's so easy to get caught up in what the crowd says, and some of that's very useful, very helpful. One thing I always say to ministers when they ask about, what is the biggest challenge? I think sometimes the biggest challenge is to be able to accept the criticism and use it no matter how it was delivered, right? Because sometimes it's delivered very poorly, but it could have a good result. But, being willing to say, ultimately, I do this for God, and therefore I'm going to strive to please him in this. Bishop, thank you so much for being on today. I thought this was a great discussion, and I really thank you for taking time out of your schedule to be with us.
And Chris, let me tell you once again how honored I am to be here. Thank you so much. And prayers that this ministry continues to grow. What this podcast has done is so important. And so prayers that God continues to bless you and bless this podcast.
Absolutely. Thank you for saying that. And I want to let our viewers and listeners know that if they have a question about today's podcast episode, they can email me at chris.mccurley@rippleoflight.com. If you have a question specifically for Bishop, we will forward it on to him, and I'm sure he would be happy to answer any questions that you might have. Bishop, thanks again, man. Safe travels if you ever get your car fixed and get to go back to that. Wow.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Yeah, and thank everyone for tuning in. Until next time, may the Lord bless you and keep you. Sincerely, Chris.